from the BBC World Service, bringing you extraordinary personal stories from around the globe. Search for Lives Less Ordinary wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry. I'm Charmaine Cozier. Each week, one question, four expert witnesses and an answer. September 2023. Olaf Scholz is nearing the halfway point of his first term as Chancellor of Europe's largest economy, Germany. 2 years before, his Social Democratic Party's winning election campaign included a pledge to add 400,000 new homes to the country's housing stock each year. That goal has been missed by hundreds of thousands of dwellings. Instead, the country's construction sector is experiencing its biggest slump in activity for decades, and the Chancellor has led an industry-wide crisis summit to try and revive it. So this week we're asking, why can't Germany build enough homes?
Part 1. 42 branches.
The government started with a number of 400,000 they want to build every year. Right now we are at 250,000 flats we are building right now, and numbers are falling massively.
So when did it become clear to you that this was becoming a deeper problem for Germany?
Mid of last year, because mid of last year we stopped selling anything. Now they're coming back very, very slow.
Dirk Zalewski is president of the German House Building Federation. He's also CEO of a company that builds houses and apartments. Since the start of this year, hundreds of building firms have filed for insolvency. It's an industry that draws on a range of skills from dozens of other professions, including electricians, architects, carpenters, structural engineers and plumbers.
At my building and construction site, there are 42 companies working. We have 42 branches we need to build one house. So that's a big part of German economy, of course.
And that economy is being weakened by the same combination of factors affecting other countries.
First, the corona pandemic, and of course the war, and massively higher prices for everything we need for building. Especially steel, for example, was 400% more money than before.
Interest rate hikes have also made borrowing impossible for many businesses.
We came from 0 to 1, and now we are at 4 to 5% for loans. So people can't afford anymore this high costs for building.
So projects are postponed or abandoned and new orders dwindle. There are also issues within the German building system which compound those financial pressures. Getting permission to prepare land for building can take between 2 or 20 years. The process is also not digital, so everything is done on paper, which adds to the long lead times. Once that's sorted, separate permissions are needed for each individual building on the land.
We are a federal state, and we have 16 states in Germany with 16 different regulations how to build. So if you have a good plan for a good house in Berlin, for example, you can't build that in Munich. And you always need a new permission, and you get it from the town you want to build in. Even if you build the same building, once again, in the same city, you have to get a new permission for that. And the process starts at the beginning.
That bit of the process can take another 6 months or 3 years. After that, building can begin, but only if the budgets are still big enough.
And that's the problem why we are now in this crisis. We have permissions, but they won't come to a construction site because all numbers were totally different 2 or 3 years ago when they applied for the permission.
Figures from Germany's Federal Statistical Office for the first 6 months of 2023 show dramatic percentage falls across the different types of homes approved for construction compared to the same period last year.
But I think they will fall much quicker in the coming month because the permits for higher rising buildings need 2 or 3 years in Germany from the beginning till you get the permit.
And lack of funding means some permitted projects will never start. A growing population means demand for somewhere affordable to live is stronger than ever.
So when you see that we were around 80 million people, inhabitants in 2021. And right now we are at 84 million people. There was a net increase from Ukraine by 1.5 million people last year. We have to build much more because the most people coming to Germany, like from Ukraine or other parts of the world, are going to the big cities like Berlin and Hamburg. And they have the main problem with when you are something like a nurse or a fireman, you won't be able to afford a rented flat in these towns.
Recent estimates suggest there is a shortage of 700,000 homes in Germany. In his role as president of the German House Building Federation, Dirk Zalewski recently attended a summit on the housing crisis with Chancellor Scholz and other industry groups. On the day of that meeting, the government announced a raft of measures to promote affordable housing. There are tax incentives, relaxation of some building regulations, and $19 billion towards social housing between now and 2027. It's part of a wider $47 billion package, which is also funded by federal states and municipalities. But will that be enough to get the industry moving again?
24 and 25 are the worst years to come because projects that are not started right now won't get fixed and ready in 24 and 25. But I think the door is open to talk. And I think now we are in a dialogue, and even the longest way starts with the first step. And I think the first step is done in this dialogue.
Germany is the largest economy in Europe, so it's been hit especially hard, but it's not alone.
Part 2. Europe's problems.
I think it's very interesting also for other countries to keep an eye on what's going on in Germany for different reasons.
Alicia Pittini is the research director at Housing Europe, the European Federation of Public Cooperative and Social Housing.
We've seen similar patterns in Germany, but also in Denmark, to a lesser extent in Austria over the past couple of years, and in general also a slowdown in social housing productions in countries like France, for instance, that typically had a very historically very high social housing production. So it's not a unique case, but it's of course one of the countries where, if we look at the construction sector, the situation is particularly complicated.
The reasons for the undersupply of social housing varies from country to country, but a lack of public funding is a frequent one.
This has been, unfortunately, a trend for decades by now, with some exceptions, of course. But so we are today in a situation of a housing crisis that it's becoming clearer and clearer, especially in urban areas across Europe. If, for instance, you take Brussels, which is actually where I'm living, the number of households registered to obtain social housing has increased from 49,000 3 years back to almost 52,000 according to the most recent data. And at the same time, there are new studies that show that the number of homeless in Brussels has increased by 30% since 2018. So we really start to see clear evidence and clear human tragedy, basically, that supports the argument of a growing affordable housing crisis.
Building new homes isn't the only way to narrow housing supply gaps. In some countries, vacant homes could be renovated, but that also requires funding. Planning and building housing programmes can take 30 to 40 years. That's longer than most political careers.
It's extremely important to guarantee stability for the sector, stability of regulation, stability of funding, of financing. And unfortunately, this is not always the case. With the change of government, there may be drastic changes in policies. And this, of course, creates enormous problems for social housing when it's the case.
Last month, the German government confirmed that a set of proposed building insulation regulations will be paused.
To some extent, more flexibility might be needed. We've seen it also within our membership, for instance, to respond to the large influx of refugees, especially from Syria in 2015. For example, some of the Nordic countries like Denmark or Sweden temporarily decided to relax building requirements and standards so as to be able to provide faster accommodation. At the same time, looking at the environmental side, of course, we are more and more aware that the homes that we build and renovate today will have an impact on the environment for the next 20, 50 years. So it's very important to keep in mind quality as a driving principle, I would say.
Some European countries are faring better than others.
Denmark, for instance, has a very stable funding system with a national revolving fund dedicated to supporting housing associations with actually resources that come from the sector. France is also one of the most interesting countries in that it has the highest number of social housing units and the highest levels of social housing construction over the past 10 years. So although there have been some negative changes lately, but the sector is supported by a stable financing framework and a very well-regulated system. A positive sign is the fact that the price of construction materials, especially in Europe, is starting to decrease, but we're still in a situation where we risk to see a dramatic shortfall in housing production over the next few years.
There are also cracks in the labour market.
This is also something that we hear from members of Housing Europe across Europe, Ireland, Belgium, Germany, Austria, you name it. There are probably different elements leading to this. One being that in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of construction companies had a lot of troubles or went bankrupt, ceased to exist, and then there were labor movements as a result that left some countries with a real shortage of labor, but it's also a matter of having the right skills. So a number of new needs and new skills that need to be developed.
Lives Less Ordinary is the podcast with astonishing personal stories from across the globe.
You are the only survivor. I say, how? What about others? Say they all died.
Expect the unexpected.
We were having a big tearful discussion of how could someone ever do this? How could that ever happen? And that's the first time I ever came out with my story about how I was almost a school shooter.
Lives Less Ordinary from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Time for our next expert witness on another country that's more than familiar with tough housing situations.
Part 3. Lessons learned.
We have a very well-educated young population. So I hear it from my own students in the university. They think that despite doing everything right, studying hard for their exams, getting a degree, that they actually cannot live anything close to the same lifestyles their parents would have enjoyed at that period.
Michelle Norris is Professor of Social Policy at University College Dublin in Ireland.
I can tell you what the Germans did wrong, but we repeated many of their mistakes.
Germany funded social housing provision through subsidies to corporate landlords. When those contracts expired decades later, the properties stayed with the landlords.
And also a lot of the municipalities in Germany that still maintained large social housing stocks privatised them en masse after the financial crisis in 2008 and also in previous years. So the Germans have been left with a stock of social housing that's simply too small. And we have repeated many of those mistakes here. We have very high rates of social housing privatisation. About 2/3 of all the social housing units built since the sector first emerged 100 years ago have been privatised in Ireland.
Privatisation was mainly financed by bank lending, which shut off after the 2008 financial crisis.
Some house prices started to fall here and mortgage rates started to rise, and also significant problems started to emerge in banks' loans to developers. That played a key role in the wider fiscal crisis in the Republic of Ireland as the government guaranteed bank lending, and the problems in the banks and the problems in the solvency of government became intertwined. And critically, the population kept rising at a relatively high pace. And housing output collapsed from about 70,000 units per annum at the height of the property boom, down to 10,000 units per annum at the bottom of the bust. But outstanding bank loans for land purchase, servicing and construction are currently at about 2002 levels. That has created huge challenges in terms of increasing housing output to meet the needs of our growing population.
Just like Germany, Ireland's government has set a housing target. It's 30,000 new homes a year, which includes private and social housing.
Now, there is a very widespread view that that target is just simply too low. And the government has established a commission to review the housing system. And the commission announced in January that they estimate the annual supply needs to be in the range of 60,000 units.
A lack of available and affordable homes has attracted the attention of employers.
And we've seen some rather surprising interventions in the political debate from business representative bodies insisting the government plays a stronger role in trying to support housing supply and raising concern that it undersupply and also just the very high level of rents, particularly in Dublin, is actually impeding their ability to hire staff and particularly impeding their ability to attract international staff with specialist skills into the city.
Housing supply is hardwired into the political system.
The Irish government historically has generally been quite interventionist in housing markets. We had very high sales of social housing to tenants right since the 1930s. It's one of the reasons we have high home ownership. And it was also used as a job creation mechanism during periods when the economy was weak and in peripheral areas of the country. But certainly at the moment, it is, I would consider, a red-hot political issue.
The government has even stepped in to buy and take over residential projects abandoned by international backers who've decided to invest their money elsewhere.
And also the government has recently announced a grant scheme to give money to developers to complete apartment developments that they would have considered non-viable in return for selling them to first-time buyers. So that's only recently been announced, but it's quite striking that government feel the need to intervene in the market in that way and to introduce a straight subsidy to developers just over a decade and a half after many people in Ireland would have considered that the development industry was largely responsible for our economic crash. So it really indicates the levels of concern there is in government around its undersupply of housing.
Time to return to Germany. When might it get back on track?
Part 4. Cycles.
It's highly likely that we will have in the following quarters that the situation gets even worse.
Jens Boysen-Hugrive is a senior economist at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Over the last 50 years, Germany has seen long cycles of building booms and busts, some more entrenched than others.
Yeah, maybe the worst is still to come, but we assume that it will be not that bad as we experienced it in the 90s and early 2000s, for the simple reason that the circumstances are different.
In October 1990, months after the Berlin Wall that separated them was demolished, communist East Germany, which had been occupied by the former Soviet Union, and West Germany were reunited. A major construction programme to update former East German infrastructure and homes sparked a boom. However,
yeah, the boom was so extraordinary that it was followed by a very, very prolonged downturn. So there was really almost more than 10 years there where the construction sector in Germany did not that well. And it ended actually after the Great Recession. There was really a hard time for the construction sector in Germany.
The Great Recession was a sustained global economic crisis.
So there was a very long upswing after the financial crisis or the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Interest rates were relatively low. And these good conditions also were after a very long and prolonged downturn. We observed very long cycles in the German housing market, especially in residential investment in the last decades.
German construction is currently in a tough downward dip. Can any meaningful links be made between now and then?
I would say hardly any connection. So the reunification was really an extraordinary event that happened and that affected the whole economy and especially the construction sector. And this extreme upswing and this very prolonged downturn event, and this time it's more or less only the monetary policy or the interest rate environment that makes the difference. And so this time it's, I would say, it's a bit different from what we experienced in the 90s.
Home builders have been calling for measures to bring down the costs of construction. One involves reforming transfer tax paid when real estate is bought. Federal states set their own rates, which are relatively high compared to other countries.
The transfer tax is a flat rate, deviates a bit between the federal states in Germany, so between 3.5% and 6%.
So, I mean, if the idea or the view is that these taxes could be standardised or made lower, those federal states aren't going to give up that revenue that easy. So there's not going to be much appetite for going along that route, is there?
For sure, that's a problem. So it's actually politically, it's unlikely or it's not feasible that this will take place. One would have to do a rather major reform and the federal government would have to maybe change. And so it would be easier maybe to use other instruments, for instance, depreciations in the income tax or the corporate tax system to give some impulses to the construction sector.
Speaking in Parliament in September this year, Chancellor Scholz encouraged his political opponents and the regional governments to help him clear what he called a thicket of bureaucracy. If that happened, it would speed up the slow paper-based planning process and the building of new homes, but interest rates will continue to challenge.
So the upcoming quarters will be really maybe shocking, but the longer run, there are some signs that this will not be a crisis that is really that long as we observed it after the reunification. Simply the rents are going up, there's strong housing demand. It's highly likely that in 2 years' time interest rates will be again a bit lower. And that's the reasons why we assume that it's a different situation than compared to the situation that we have had after the reunification. But indeed, it is a very tough situation for sure.
So why can't Germany build enough homes? Soaring costs and a lack of investment have priced many construction projects out of the market. But there are also hurdles built into Germany's system, like navigating decentralised federal states or the lengthy paper-based building permission system. The recent billion-dollar government cash injection and relaxation of regulations will help to reduce cost. But with a significantly lower number of new orders in the pipeline and approved ones years away from completion, Germany's construction crisis is far from over. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier. It was produced by Phil Revel and researched by Matt Tolson. The editor is Tara McDermott and technical producer Cameron Ward.